So, today's program, we have a good turnout, and there's a reason. And it's going to be Jaynie Chowning, and she's going to talk shortly. We hoped her brother could come visit with us, but he's busy in Nashville or someplace doing worldwide acts. And she's talking about somebody that has a big, big influence on Springfield and Ozark and country and international music. Was a big thing. And so we're going to hear more about it. And at this time, I'd like to have Jaynie come out.
I want to thank everyone for coming today. It's so nice, and it was very honoring to be asked to speak here today about Daddy. So I have a few things to say, not many. I'm Jaynie Chowning. My husband is Randall Chowning. I have a sister, Susan Wynn, and a brother, Scott Simon. I'm mother to Betsy Miller and Wendy Murphy and Dee Chowning. We have 3 grandsons, Kevin and Nick Murphy and Luke Chowning. Let's see, who else? Let's see. I'm sister, did I say Susan Wynn? Susan, stand up, that's my sister. And I have a brother, Scott Simon, who lives in Nashville. And I'm the daughter of Rosie and Si Siman. And that's, my nephew, Chad Estes, is here. Thank you, Chad. And that's as far as I'm going to go with the family tree stuff, so you're probably glad. Daddy was born in January of 1921, right over here on Normal Street, just the other side of the college. And he always thought that was so funny that he was born on Normal Street, because nothing was normal in his life. He said he thought that house was pretty good sized, but when he was grown, he thought that house had shrunk up to the size of a cracker box. His main loves, baseball and music, dominated his life from the time he was 10 years old. He took an orange crate, put wheels on it, put dry ice in it, and went around town selling popsicles and peanuts so he could make enough money to go to St. Louis, he and his dad, and see the Cardinals play. And he was doing great. One of the people he sold to was Ralph Foster, who owned KWTO and KGBX. And he was doing great till some policeman came and stopped him and said, "Hey, do you have a peddler's license?" A peddler's license? No, he didn't have a peddler's license. So that was the end of the popsicle business, but he'd made enough money to take he and his dad to St. Louis to see the Cardinals play, so he was thrilled. He had a wrestling franchise here, and he booked all the wrestling matches at the Shrine Mosque, and he was only in high school. So this was a big deal, and the wrestlers were supposed to hate each other, but they didn't, and they'd ride together coming to town to do the wrestling matches, and when they'd just get right outside of town, they'd split them up and put them in separate cars so nobody'd see them riding together because they were supposed to hate each other, So the wrestling business was going well until Daddy had a Japanese wrestler booked the night they bombed Pearl Harbor. That was kind of the end of that, and he was getting ready to go to the Navy, so he sold the wrestling franchise to this guy, and a few weeks later, he went to the guy and he said, I know you're getting ready to do some matches, and I'm really happy for you. Have you thought about a ring? He'd sold him the franchise, but not the ring. So the guy had to pony up for the ring. Oh, gosh. When Don Richardson wanted to be on the Jubilee and work, behind the scenes, and he was a creative writer, and he knew that to do that, he had to go straight to the horse's mouth. So he wrote the guys a letter, and he started it out with, "Dear Horse's Mouth." So here's some information about Daddy that's straight from the horse's mouth. Before television, we did maybe 1,000 or 1,500 different shows, like the Red Foley show on radio. the Tennessee Ernie Ford Show on radio, Smiley Burnett with the Whippoorwills and Shorty and Sue and Sally. We did the Carter Family, Chet Atkins radio show, the George Morgan Robin Hood Flower Show, and Bill Ring General Mills Show. We were the regular network TV show on ABC. We were the first regular country music show to be done on network TV and in color on NBC, following the Jubilee with the 5-star Jubilee. At one time, we were doing 2.5 hours a week out of Springfield, Missouri, live on network, which made us the third most important origination point in America, third only to New York and Hollywood. So we made our little niche for a minute or two. The 4 stockholders in Crossroads TV, the Jubilee's production company, were Ralph Foster, Lester Cox, John Mahaffey, and me. We approached NBC TV about doing the 5-star Jubilee after the original Jubilee went off the air. Tex Ritter, Jimmy Wakely, Carl Smith, Snooky Lanson, and Rex Allen rotated in front of the spotlight each week with one of them acting as host. Originally, I put 3 artists on Victor that stayed 25 years or more: Porter Wagner, the Browns, and Chet Atkins. We had Leroy Van Dyke and, of course, Porter and Bobby Lord, Marvin Rainwater, Shug Fisher, Wanda Jackson, Brenda Lee, Sonny James, Hawkshaw Hawkins, etc., and, of course, the Jubilee Promenaders. We had discovered Brenda Lee, or Red did, down in Georgia. I was involved with helping negotiate her first record contract with Paul Cohen on Decca. We were doing 3 shows at a time, you know, the one I was buying talent for that was coming up in 3 weeks, and the one we were building sets for that was coming up next week, and one we were in production on for this Saturday. And this is a little bit of how Daddy got started doing this stuff in the beginning. There was a little dance hall called Half a Hill, and the man hired me to help him because he was getting up in age. After Mr. Hickman died, then I became the town's promoter, and I was still going to high school. I was so exhilarated standing up in front of those big bands: Tommy Dorsey, Glenn Miller, Benny Goodman. My basic origin, of course, was country, and between country music and big band sounds, I was terribly excited. Daddy noticed on the Jubilee that Red Foley had a little problem right at the very beginning of the show for about 30 seconds. And so he says, I talked to him about it, and he said, man, it's just impossible to get away from that. As much as I do this show, when I know that I'm reaching more people instantly out there in that audience than I'll ever play to in all of my personal appearances I could ever make in my lifetime, that is exhilarating and exciting. It almost causes you to panic till I swallow a couple of times. He never got over being nervous. Daddy made a contract with him for 5 years, and they ran for 10 years, and neither one of them ever looked at the contract again after they signed it. Daddy took Red to the Dinah Shore show in Hollywood, and this little boy came up and said, oh yes, Red Foley. He's the Bing Crosby of the country field. Daddy said, I beg your pardon, sir. Bing Crosby is the Red Foley of the pop field. Red was standing there, and he loved that. That was early in their relationship. So Bing Crosby's brother Everett was his manager. Red was really impressed with what I said. He hugged me, and from then on, he and I never referred to each other as Si and Red. He'd call me on the phone, and he'd say, hey, Everett, this is Bing. So when the Jubilee went off, people were always asking him what the ramifications of it going off were. But he said Red had an income tax evasion thing that was dismissed against him. He won it, but that made the sponsors a little shaky. Daddy said we had some union problems because ISSAT, International Stagehands Union, claimed it, which was theater stagehands. And the IBEW, International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, claimed it because it was new and it was electrical. And neither one of them had enough people to actually claim the show. So they were having problems with that, and nobody claimed it at all, of course, until it got big. But then Daddy would tell people, well, it was canceled due to illness. And they'd say, really? Why? Yeah, ABC got sick of us. No show lasts forever. They did 6 years. In fact, the union one time came to one of Daddy's shows, and they said, you can't put this show on because you don't have enough union musicians here to play the show. And Daddy said, how many more union musicians do I have to have? And they said 12. And Daddy thought a minute, and he said, okay, you give me 12 tuba players, and I'll put everyone on the stage tonight. Of course, they didn't have 12 tuba players, so that was that. Said after that, he had to figure out what was going on with his life. He'd always been so involved in the music that was on the Jubilee and on KWTO. He was responsible for a song called Satisfied Mind, which he found in the piano bench up on the third floor of KWTO, and got it out, and he wanted Jean Shepherd to record it, which she did, and so did Red Foley and his daughter, and Porter Wagner, and that's how that came about. He and John Mahaffey formed Earl Barton Music. That was the first publishing company. Then later Rosebridge, and then later Shady Dell, and then Strawberry Hill. They had different associations with different songwriters, and people kept coming up to him and saying, you know, I met Earl Barton the other day. And we thought that was so funny because Earl was Daddy's middle name and Barton was John Mahaffey's middle name, so there was no Earl Barton. But they'd swear they'd met him, you know. Oh, gosh. Daddy's first BMI award was with Company's Comin' with Porter Wagner, written by Johnny Mullins. Daddy said the biggest hit we had was with Always on My Mind. It was written for Elvis, and he did it. It was even in his movie, This Is Elvis. It was often becoming a big hit with him, except right at the time they released the record, he and Priscilla split up. Daddy said, I think they have a little problem here. So on the flip side of that record was Separate Ways, and so radio started playing Separate Ways instead of Always on My Mind. But that's the way it goes. Willie Nelson recorded it, and not only did they have Song of the Year 2 years in a row, both pop and country, which has only happened like 3 times in the history of the business, so that was a big deal. Randall and I were sitting with Mother one day, and she said, you know, I wish I'd kept those Christmas cards from Elvis. And we were going, yeah, we wish you had too. But she didn't. And I want to emphasize right now that if it weren't for forward-looking businessmen like Lester Cox and Ralph Foster, their support to Daddy was just incredible. You know, it was wonderful to have those type of people here in Springfield. So, my husband Randall did a tribute to Wayne Carson at the College of the Ozarks after his death in 2015. My brother Scott sent these comments, and so I wanted to read them to you. My dad started working with Wayne in the early 60s. We heard many of Wayne's efforts at our home. Songs just written to be tried out on my mom and sisters to see if there was anything there. Si and Wayne would hop in my dad's latest Cadillac and drive to Nashville. They would meet with labels, thanks to Si's Jubilee connections. He'd gotten Porter Wagner his record deal, turned Chester into Chet Atkins, got him a deal on Victor, helped Brenda Lee secure a deal with Owen Bradley, and get the Browns their deal on RCA. They probably heard pass more than an NFL quarterback. But hey, they didn't know they couldn't. Their life lessons said it was possible for something great to happen. No area had a monopoly on talent. They believed in each other and believed they could do it from the Ozarks. The big break came when Chet took a liking to Wayne's song Somebody Like Me in 1966. The story is famous and probably mostly true. You have to know that when I say story, well, I'm talking about the final version that Si and Wayne came up with. They were consummate storytellers. If the truth wasn't enough, they'd put in a twist or two, to ensure that the listener was delighted with what they heard. But this story is true, or shall I say, this story is a true story of how it was told to me. Chet's secretary gets Wayne on the phone, and Chet and Eddie tells Wayne he likes the song but thought it was too short. And Wayne dictated a verse off the top of his head on the spot. Eddie cut the song, and it was a #1 hit and won a BMI Pop Award, too. In 1967, a song that my dad had pitched 20 or 30 times, maybe more, was picked up by Dan Penn as a song for a new group at American Studios, the Box Tops. And the letter became one big hit. So short, though, that they added 30 seconds of jet airplane sound to get it to 1 minute and 57 seconds. And the letter was the biggest hit that was ever recorded in Memphis. Now I'm going to tell you a story on Scott. And Susan, you'll remember this. One time Bobby Vinton came on the Jubilee, and Susan and I were so excited because we were big fans of Bobby Vinton. And so Daddy took us down there and introduced us, and Bobby Vinton gave us his autograph. And he turned around to Scott and he said, "Would you like an autograph?" And Scott said, "What's an autograph?" And Bobby Vinton said, "Well, I take a piece of paper and I write my name on it and I give it to you." And Scott said, "Well, I can take a piece of paper and write my name on it and give it to you." When my parents got married in 1947, Daddy made a recording of the ceremony and made it into a record. That was certainly unheard of in that day and time. Not long after they got married, Mother was having company over for supper, and Daddy had gone fishing that day. He came home, put his catch in the bathtub, and so I think Mother was just ready to skin him alive because people came and you could just smell fish, everywhere. There was never a dull moment in our house. When my brother Scott was born, Daddy took me and my sister Susan into the studio at KWTO, and we made a recording to give to my mother as a present. The singing Siman sisters had a very short career. Daddy was a creative thinker. He had the most positive outlook on life of anyone I've ever known. His motto was, "Think spring, life is short." He worked hard. He played hard. He was honest, and he always had a joke. Sometimes he'd make up a joke and tell it to someone and just wait to see how long that joke came back around to him. Here's a sampling of the artists that recorded some of Daddy's songs that he published. Alabama, Eddie Arnold, Mo Bandy, the Box Tops, Joe Cocker, Roberta Flack, Red Foley, Tennessee Ernie Ford, Waylon Jennings, Brenda Lee, Willie Nelson, The Boys, both Pet Shop and Oak Ridge, Gary Stewart, Johnny Paycheck, Elvis Presley, Ronnie Prophet, Sammy Smith, B.J. Thomas, Conway Twitty, Porter Wagner, Dionne Warwick, Gene Watson, Farron Young, John and Robin. One of the great songwriters that Daddy worked with was Ronnie Self. A lot of you probably knew him. He was known for writing the 1960 Brenda Lee hit "I'm Sorry" and "Sweet Nothings" and other rockabilly hits. He wrote and recorded more than 3,000 songs. One night, Wayne, Carson, and Ronnie were hanging out in Nashville. Ronnie had a gold record for "I'm Sorry," and they decided to see if that record would actually play. So they took it off of the record and put it on the turntable, and it had a John Philip Sousa march on it. Ronnie said, "I didn't write that piece of shit," and they took it to the front steps of BMI and burned it. Oh, gosh. Ike Turner called Daddy one day, and he thought Wayne and Daddy had been doing some really pretty cool stuff with their music, and so he made a deal with him to meet him in Memphis and record one of Wayne's songs called "Cussin' and Crying and Carrying On." I love that song. When they finished it, Ike and Tina flew back to Vegas to perform again that night. Now that's rock and roll. The song was eventually released on Pompeii Records. Wayne played guitar on the original sessions. Ike was slick, though. He claimed he'd written a couple of Wayne's songs. They got that corrected. The first time Smiley Burnett came to our house, Mother had cooked corned beef and cabbage. You all know how that smells. Well, he walked in the house and said, "Corned beef and cabbage, my favorite." So he enjoyed that. And Mother found out later that he was a gourmet cook, and she said, "I'm never cooking for him again." So he'd call and give her a grocery list, and then he'd do the cooking when he'd come to our house. Smiley sometimes called Daddy, and he'd give him a one-liner, and then he'd hang up before Daddy could say a word. So that was pretty funny, too. Tex Ritter was supposed to be on the Jubilee one night, and they were supposed to shoot him in the chest with a rubber-tipped arrow, but somebody missed and shot him in the forehead. And, of course, it was live TV, so you can't edit it. And he said, "What in the hell are you trying to do, kill me?" So that was a big deal back then. I have wonderful memories of Red Foley in the Jubilee days. Red stayed at our house some when he first came to Springfield before his family moved here, and he got a house. And he was just a gentle, loving person. He helped me pull a tooth one time while I was sitting on his lap. He dried the dishes after supper. Mother said we walked in one day and Red was asleep on the couch, and I walked over and gave him a little kiss on the cheek. He woke up and had tears in his eyes over that kiss. He adored children. His heart was on his sleeve when he sang, and especially his songs of inspiration. The IRS wanted to make an example of Red. They came to Daddy and said they wanted him to testify against Red. And Daddy said he had a problem with that because Red hadn't done anything wrong. Well, the IRS audited my parents for years after that. Phew. Okay, this is a little story about, I'd go to rehearsals on Saturday for the Jubilee and hang out. I thought it was such a great place for a kid to be, And the souvenir shop had these wonderful souvenirs in it, and Bill Ring would show me the souvenirs, and I was just in the middle of everything. But I was handy when they needed a kid. And one year I was the featured Easter bunny on the Jubilee, dressed in a bunny costume. I think there's a picture of it over here. And I had a broom in my hand, and I was supposed to be polishing the egg. And on the TV, here was the egg, and then it would flash the names of the people that were going to be on the show that night. And then when they said, "And the star of the show, Red Foley," he was supposed to break that paper egg and come out on stage, which is all well and good, except nobody told me that he was going to break through that paper egg and come onto the stage. And it scared me so badly I jumped off the stage. So at least that was in rehearsal, so we were better by showtime. Mother made Rosie Acres a home for all of the people that came there. Rosie Acres was a hopping little place. She'd play the piano for people who came to visit. I remember one time after supper when Tex Ritter and Smiley Burnett were there, and they started telling jokes, and Mother said, "It's time for you kids to go to bed." So I guess they'd gone past the kid-friendly portion of the evening. Daddy was gone a lot, but when he was home, wow. We had ponies, which my brother and sister showed. We'd go floating and camping. We'd have Sunday dinners, and the ponies would come up to the picnic table and drink the leftover coffee from the coffee cups. I'd say that was a pretty idyllic childhood. Wayne Carson stayed with us a lot. Daddy worked with his folks, Shorty and Sue Thompson. Wayne's parents invited my parents out to Walnut Grove one time to have supper, so they went. After supper, Mother was drying the dishes with Sue, and Wayne and his brother Gary walked in. They had a dead possum on a shovel. And Mother screamed and dropped the plate that she was holding. But Wayne became a member of our family. He came to my piano recitals. He was at family dinners on Sundays and holidays. He'd write songs down in the basement where it was cool in the summer and warm in the winter. And I'd sit there and listen to him writing songs. There was no lack of engaging conversation when Wayne and Daddy were together. One Sunday afternoon when we were having supper, my grandmother, Granny, told Daddy, "Stop wiping your hands on your pants, and Wayne, you shouldn't be using that kind of language." Wayne came one time to visit and brought a girlfriend of his. And Mother and Daddy weren't home, but he knew where the key was, so he just let himself in with his girlfriend. And Mother and Daddy had never met her. So they weren't home, and she went down in the basement to do some laundry, and Wayne left to go see some of his friends. And Mother came home and heard the washer and dryer going in the basement and thought, what in the world? So she walked into the basement, and here was this woman she had never met, and she said, well, excuse me, I don't believe we've met, which was a typical mother statement, if you know my mother. Back in the day, it took Daddy 2 days to get to Nashville, so he'd usually stop halfway in Poplar Bluff and spend the night. And he was there one night, and somebody said, you need to come hear this little girl sing. Her name was Della Ray, and she was a great singer. So Daddy called Mother and said, I'm bringing this little girl home with me. I think she stayed off and on for a couple of years. And she did the best Donald Duck imitation you've ever seen in your life. Anyway, she did some sides with Chet Atkins. He produced her a little bit, but she never had a really big hit. Daddy booked the Associated Grocer shows. People like Jimmy Dean, George Strait, Johnny Cash, and June Carter. I remember going to the Shrine Mosque to hear George Strait at the beginning of his career. And I thought, man, he's sure good looking and he can sure sing, but he is quiet. He didn't say anything on stage. But Johnny and June put on a great show, and they were great entertainers. And Jimmy Dean did some of those Associated Grocer show. He came to spend the night one night at our house. It was just happened to be on my birthday, so I could have sworn he came just for my birthday, you know. Daddy had an open door policy at his office, so all the musicians around here would go hang out. And it didn't hurt that he had a subscription to Billboard magazine, which was pretty expensive. So those guys could all look at it and see what was going on in the music industry. He also had a song plugger, which was a sheet that told you who was recording what and when, and if they were looking for ballads or up-tempo songs or what they were looking for. So everybody loved reading that, too. In 1998, Daddy received the Missourian of the Year Award posthumously. Mother accepted the award for him, and these are some excerpts from her speech. From childhood throughout his life, Si Siman was successfully motivated by his enthusiasm, devotion, and love for American music. When he was 9 years old, one of his uncles got married. The uncle and his bride were very young, and Si loved to be with them. In fact, he begged and pleaded until they agreed to take him with them on their honeymoon. But what really fascinated him was their portable wind-up record player and the records that he could play on it. That old player was directly responsible for his lifelong interest in music. His natural next step was to become a promoter of musical acts. When our daughter Janie's second grade class was asked to tell about their father's occupations, she announced, "My daddy's a bookie." He kind of sat me down that night and told me really what he did. Well, he did book most of the big band appearances at the Shrine Mosque. In fact, Frank Sinatra made his first appearance with the Tommy Dorsey Band in Springfield. Many ticket buyers were so upset that Jack Leonard was not singing, and they lined up at the box office wanting their money back. They sure didn't intend to pay to hear an unknown sing. Not only did Si Siman book big bands at the Shrine Mosque, but he also booked acts to perform at the Ozark Empire Fair, including exotic fan dancer Sally Rand, for whom he'd had a wooden floor built along with other special equipment. He decided to sleep at the installation that night prior to the show to guard those things. He brought a chair and a blanket from home. When he awoke the next morning, the special equipment was gone, the blanket under which he slept was gone, and the wooden floor was warped due to a rainfall in the night. This caused him to make an on-the-spot decision that he would not seek a career as a night watchman. Music was not Si's only lifelong love. He also loved sports, and especially baseball. After first serving as a bat boy for the Springfield Cardinals when he was younger, he worked during his high school years for the St. Louis Cardinals with a scout named Charlie Barrett, driving him all over the country looking for ball players. After Barrett died, Si walked into Branch Rickey's office in St. Louis and said he really wanted that job as a scout. Branch Rickey agreed that Si Siman was certainly qualified and would no doubt be the best one for the job, but the Cardinal organization just didn't hire scouts of his age. Si was barely 17 years old. One day he came home from the office and told me that he, Ralph Foster, Lester Cox, and John Mahaffey were going to start a network country music show. That's how the Jubilee began. We needed a big name to head up the show, so the two of us drove to Nashville, went to the Grand Ole Opry, and whisked away their big star, Red Foley. I would recommend 2.5 hours of live television every Saturday night for 6 years to anyone wanting sleepless nights and bleeding ulcers. But it was great fun to be in on the beginning of the television explosion. Great job, Mother. If you all get the opportunity, you should head down to Point Lookout, Missouri, to the Ralph Foster Museum at the College of the Ozarks. They have a Si Siman music room there, and it's really pretty cool. Make sure you make a reservation at the Keeter Center to have lunch, and you can go in the Edwards Mill and buy some wonderful apple butter and just enjoy that campus. It's beautiful. Daddy always signed his letters sincerely. So I'll sign off saying, sincerely, thank all of you for coming and thank you for having me. Thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh my gosh. Whoa. I'm used to this happening for Randall. Does anyone have any questions? I probably covered everything plus some, so sure.
When we worked at the Ozark Jubilee in the late 50s, sometimes Red would have a little trouble with the words to the Lord's Prayer, which is one of his signature tunes. So we teased him about that a lot. He didn't know what to do, and we suggested that if he didn't quit forgetting the words to it, we would write the words to the song on the stage backwards so the audience couldn't read it, so when he put his head down, supposedly overcome with
He was an emotional person, which came through in his singing and in his songs of inspiration. It really came through. He was wonderful. Go ahead.
Add to your list of artists that recorded Si songs. Dickie Lee.
Yes, that's right. Number one.
Nancy Sinatra.
That's right.
Mel Tillis.
That's right.
Billy Walker.
That's right.
And I'm sure countless others.
I'm sure there are countless others too.
But
Thanks.
That was all Strawberry Hill.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm real proud of that.
You should be, Rocky. Okay.
In collecting records, of course, the Skipper label was a label that your dad had, Skipper record label.
Mhm.
We all know the name Ronnie sell, we know Vicky sell, Dina sell, but one of the records that I've run onto 4 or 5 different times, and I'd love for someone to tell me who it is, I don't think it's Ronnie under an alias, is Wavy Self. It's on Skipper. Does anybody ever hear the name Wavy Self?
I have no idea who that is.
the Grateful Dead with it.
Skipper label, which is Springfield.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, of course, they called Ralph Foster Skipper, so that. But I don't know who Wavy is.
Could have been Ronnie's son.
Could have been. We should ask Vicky that. Take a look at some of the things over here if you'd like. I tried to bring a sampling of things that we had. And
Jaynie,
yes.
you were talking about Wayne Carson writing music down in the basement.
Mm-hmm.
Was he just doing that, just writing it down and singing to himself, or did he have musical accompaniment?
He was down there by himself in the basement with his guitar, and he was writing songs and trying to figure out the melody and the lyrics. And so I'd sit on the basement steps and listen to him, And then sometimes he'd come up to the piano upstairs, and he was a great guitar player. Wasn't such a great piano player, but he could sit there and pick out, a melody. And so I'd just sit there and listen to all of that, and it was great fun.
Didn't he keep a recorder quite often?
Yeah. He did, but I mean, some of these were in such early beginning stages that he wasn't doing that. He was just sitting there trying to figure it out. But yeah.
Do you know the story about why Wayne wrote that song, Who's Julie?
I'm not sure. Are you going to tell me?
I thought you might know, you might tell all these people, you probably don't know.
No, I don't know.
Wayne come home real drunk, all lying in bed, talking in his sleep, Julie.
Oh, and Bridget said, "Who's Julie?"
Opened up her fist and knocked the hell out of him.
Yep.
So after about 5 or 6 times, then I guess he went down on the couch. The next day, he got up and wrote a song, Who's Julie?
Yep. I had heard that story. Sorry. Chris?
One night it was when I first met your dad, it was at the studio there, Mid-American Studios. And for some reason I'd met Wayne the night before, the executive, Don Clements and Rex were all playing.
Yeah.
They invited me over to the studio for an all-nighter, whatever. And we played all night and drinking Jack and talking and crazy stuff. And so it was, I think it was about 8 o'clock in the morning, and your dad walked in, and we were all just, you know, kind of having a good time. And your dad goes, "Wayne, you're a millionaire." He goes, "Oh, yeah, right." He said, No, you're a bona fide millionaire." He says, "Well, why?" He said, "Look at this album. Some English guy named Joe Cocker
Just recorded the letter.
for you,
Yeah.
and it went $1 million. It just hit 1 million sales.
Yeah.
And you are now a millionaire." So he reached out to Dad with a bottle jacket.
And went about his day, yeah. That sounds about right.
Well, I gotta go eat some breakfast. So I walked out.
Those stories could go on and on, you know. They're just great stories. But yeah, Mike?
Can you confirm any details with that story that Hogan did about the caboose up on the hill on Highway B out there?
Okay, here's the scoop on the caboose on top of the hill in Northview. Ralph Foster owned that place, and he'd go hunting with his buddies out there. And so they were out there hunting one time, and this guy from the Frisco was hunting with them. And this guy accidentally shot Uncle Ralph's hat off his head, which I'm sure they were all mortified. Thank goodness it didn't hurt him. But this guy felt so bad about it that he gave him the caboose, and they moved it up on top of this hill. So when they go out there hunting, they could go inside there and get warm and have their lunch. So that's how the caboose got up there. So Ralph owned it, and then my parents owned it, and they built a cabin up there, and we went up there. There were lots of great memories up there at that place. But then when Daddy got cancer, he was worried about Mother having to take care of that. So he sold it to Charlie Edel and
What did they call that place?
Windy Mountain Farms. Yeah. Willie Nelson did not live there. He was never there.
Paul Harvey used to come down and hunt there?
Yeah, I think he did. They hunted quail a lot there, too, you know. It was a wonderful place. So,
A couple of things. One, Ed Filmer has a video he did years ago of your dad, and he's put it on his website on YouTube.
great,
So
great.
go to Ed Filmer on YouTube, I guess, and you'll find it.
Okay.
And that'll be something very authentic coming from Si Siman. And Melinda Mullins, a Moon, and her band is having a salute to Johnny Mullins Thursday night at Lindbergh's. It's called the
Johnny Mullins Collection Full Band Show, 6:30 to 8:30, $7.
I loved it.
That's a nice little thing coming up in a few days. So anyway, any more questions?
I'm Dan McCurry, I do
Yeah.
the Wires in the Woods magazine, and our first issue did a story on the Ozark Jubilee. We talked to Jaynie a lot, had a little sidebar in there directly with, and there's a few copies back there.
Yeah, there's copies back there that look kind of like this. And it's not just the local magazine, it's more than that.
Okay.
Can you tell us what are your favorite memories of the Jubilee and hanging out there at the rehearsals or the performances?
Well, I loved the promenaders, and one of the promenaders was named Janie Lou. well, my name's Jane Louise, but when I was little, everybody called me Jaynie Lou. And so I thought that was so cool that she had the same name. And I remember hanging out back there, and oh, they'd put hand cream on my hands, and they'd teach me a few steps, you know, the square dancing, and the stars would come in and out. And of course, they were always all very nice to kids, and you know, they'd stop and give me a hug, and I loved to see the cameras going. You know, when they got those cameras, Mother had to co-sign for those cameras, those huge cameras. And she was real leery of signing for those because it was the equivalent of buying a house, you know, so it was a big deal. But I just loved it. Red was my favorite. And when he was around, you know, I was always happy. And, of course, Daddy was there. And they'd take a break at lunch and go to that little restaurant, little cafe just half a block away. And that was always fun, you know, getting to eat lunch down there. People buy us chips and Cokes. And, you know. It was all fun. I remember one time George Morgan was on there singing Candy Kisses, and they had a candy counter set up, and I was supposed to be sitting on the candy counter with a piece of candy in my hand, and when it was the solo of the song, I was supposed to put the piece of candy in his mouth, which I did, but I'd forgotten to take the paper off of it, so I think it kind of screwed up his performance. Oh, well, such is life, live TV.
One of these pictures has a Cisco kid on there?
Yes.
Yeah, what was he doing? Was he just riding his horse through Springfield?
No, he was on the Jubilee, and he came, and Mother said he took his sombrero off and made this sweeping bow to her and kissed her hand, and she thought he was so handsome, you know, and Susan and I got to visit with him and have our picture taken, so that was fun. Okay, thank you again so very much. I appreciate it.